Well, good morning, or is it good afternoon or good evening where you're at? It is certainly a great privilege to be able to share our work to such a diverse audience as this. My name is Gary Fraser. I've been Director of Adventist Health Studies here at Loma Linda University for many years, of course, assisted by talented colleagues and many other helpers. What we've been doing is looking at the health experience of Adventists who live their lives in different ways, and also comparing the health experience of Adventists as a whole group compared to non-Adventists in the same communities. But first, there's 3 or 4 points that I would just like to make before we begin. I've discovered that there's little else that can arouse the emotions and sometimes the theological ire quite as quickly as discussions about what we eat. I want to say up front that I'm a scientist and a physician, and when I recommend a particular way of eating, I'm not making a theological statement, but a health-based statement. Nevertheless, a desire to respect our bodies and their health is a proudly held tradition, of course, in Adventism, and an acknowledged historic Adventist religious virtue. But just how that works out in your life is for you to decide. Secondly, food choices are an intensely personal proposition and depend on such things as personal taste, economics, culture, family background, existing health problems perhaps, and even traditions. And food choices, in my opinion, are no litmus test for righteousness. You know, the litmus little strip of paper, you put it in a solution, if it turns red, it's acid, blue, it's alkali. It's not as simple as that, is it? Thirdly, even despite different possibilities in different parts of the world and what you eat, it is generally possible to at least trend in particular directions as far as our health habits. And lastly, of these preliminary remarks, I think we need to bear in mind that less good foods are not poisons in the sense of impending catastrophic consequences. Rather, their importance is generally an increase or a reduction in risk of particular health problems by perhaps 10%, even as high as 50%, but this happening over a period of decades. So in my opinion, less good choices are not necessarily intrinsically evil, but rather suboptimal from a health perspective. Okay, well, now let's go through my slides, and I just want to share with you some of the results that we have found that I hope will be of interest and will be helpful. I'm hoping my internet does not drop, in which case I may need to divide this presentation to 2 parts, but we'll see how it goes. So Adventist health studies have been conducted from Loma Linda over a period of many years, actually 6 decades of exciting discovery about eating and other health habits and health experience. Just to point out, and not go into detail, that there have been a number of studies and sub-studies, and each of them involving tens of thousands of people, maybe more. Now there have been more than 300 publications in the scientific literature about Adventist health from all of these studies. So it's been a story of scientific discovery. And of course, there are a few, if any, absolutes in science. We usually start with an idea which seems reasonable from the available evidence, maybe at the beginning quite scanty evidence. Then we build a story around that, adding evidence that enhances or reduces the credibility of that story and adjusting it in ways that seem to be helpful. So Adventists have long had a story, indeed a belief, that a plant-based diet was more healthful. Yet the idea that a plant-based diet may be more healthful did have a certain appeal also in scientific circles even by the mid-1950s. This was based on some comparisons of health experience in different cultures in different parts of the world, and people that had a very meaty, processed food diet often didn't do as well for some chronic diseases. Also, some elements of pathology, the nature of disease, and a somewhat credible story also of some biochemical and physiologic mechanisms that may favor a plant-based diet. And all that could be thought about a little bit even as far back as the 1950s. You might say, well, why should we study an Adventist population as a research group? Well, a number of reasons. One is that, of course, we don't smoke and very little use of alcohol, and these are confusing factors in the study of diet in many other populations. So Adventists also include a very large spectrum of dietary habits, right from, let's say, vegans, as we'll talk about in a moment, through to non-vegetarians. We're dealing with a very diverse population here, and this is important. And it's important also that some of these people make a little bit atypical choices with respect, say, to the general population, because one can't study an atypical diet unless some of the population are actually adherents to that diet. That allows for innovative dietary exploration. So Adventist Health Study 2, which is a study that I'll probably mostly talk about, is the largest study of vegetarians and vegans in the world and has been run from Loma Linda University since 2002. It includes about 96,000 Adventists from all over the United States and Canada, and about 26,000 African Americans as a minority emphasis group. I'd like to start off by just saying for a moment, what do we mean by these different kinds of vegetarian, non-vegetarian diets? A vegan, of course, is a person who consumes no animal products at all, no dairy, no eggs. A lacto-ovo does eat dairy to some extent, and eggs, but no flesh foods. It turns out that our lacto-ovos actually have only about 60% of the dairy as our non-vegetarians, so they're relatively low dairy on average. Pesco-vegetarians are like lacto-vegetarians, but they allow themselves to eat some fish, but no other flesh foods. Semi-vegetarians, people who eat meat, but not very often, less than once a week. Red meats and poultry. Non-vegetarians, people who, the way we defined it, who eat poultry and red meat at least once a week. Although most of our low vegetarians are low meat, as it turns out. What I intend to do now is to go through a number of common health problems, such as overweight, as you can see here, heart disease, cancer, life expectancy, and then a little bit about mental health as well. So let's start with overweight, which of course is a huge problem in the world today, particularly in the economically developed countries, but also increasingly in countries that are less economically advantaged. We find when we compare the Adventists that eat in different ways, and tens of thousands of people in each of these, many thousands, that for an average height woman, say 5'4" on the left of this graph, you can see here that comparing the vegans through the lactos, the pescos to the non-vegetarians here, we see a difference of nearly 30 pounds in weight. For an average height male, let's say 5'10", we see a very similar struggle passing through these vegetarian categories. So that's interesting, and is something that's been found in other studies. That was in non-Black subjects, and here we have it in Black African-American subjects in our study, where the trends are very different, perhaps not quite so steep a slope, but very much there in the same way. So you might ask, well, are there particular foods? And what we find, and I'm not showing you the evidence here, that the intake of meats, any kind of meats actually, is the dietary factor that most strongly predicts higher body weights in our data. Remember that all meats, even though perhaps poultry and fish may not be in quite the same hazard for many disorders as red meats, as we will see, they still all are very dense in calories and are not good for body weight to consume a lot of those. The food or the dietary factor that best predicts lower body weights in our group was actually dietary fiber. And you might know that dietary fibers are only found in plants, but not all plant-based foods are high in fiber. The highly processed foods, of course, have less fiber in general than processed plant foods even. So it would suggest that we should avoid meats to some extent, perhaps totally, and prefer plant-based foods if we're interested in our body weight. This is a rather complicated slide. It's a paper we published about 2 years ago, received a lot of attention in the press and popular literature. And you can see here, a little complicated, but we're looking at comparing the increase in weight over some decades of people who ate a lot of meals and snacks per day as compared to those who didn't, in part A, upper left. What about the length of the night fast? What do we mean by that? The length of time that elapses between the last meal in the afternoon or evening and breakfast the next morning can be up to 18 hours or so, as you can see in some of our people here. Then whether or not you consume breakfast, and then the timing of the largest meal. Was the largest meal breakfast or dinner or lunch? And we found that there were clear differences. Looking at part A, those who had more meals and snacks a day were more prone to put on weight. Those that tended to have a long period of fasting between evening and breakfast or afternoon and breakfast had less problems with putting on weight. Those who consumed breakfast put on less weight. But those who preferred dinner to be the largest meal tended to be heavier. Now, we're talking here actually about 4 or 5 pounds extra per decade of life. And you might say, well, that's not very much. But think about this. Over a period of 4 or 5 decades, we're obviously talking here 20, 25 pounds. That's about the rate that many people will gain weight, just as what seems to be a natural experience as they grow older. Isn't that a common thing that happens? I can testify to that. Have to fight a little bit against that. And it seems like some simple changes like this may largely cancel out that experience, which seems to be common and natural, but in fact may not be. What about heart disease risk factors? Here I'm talking about things like high blood pressure, diabetes, blood cholesterol that predict risk of heart disease. Well, we find here that, again, comparing our dietary patterns, that the vegans have much less treated, they're taking medications for high blood pressure as compared to the non-vegetarians. And you might say, well, maybe that's just because the vegans don't go to the doctor, they don't like to take pills, which is kind of true. But it's not only that, because we've also done studies, we've actually taken groups of these people and measured their blood pressure, and the vegans definitely have lower blood pressures. Similarly, if we compare the number of people who are currently diagnosed and treated with diabetes, there's about a 3 to 4-fold risk difference between the vegans and lactose and the non-vegetarians. Goes up like a stepladder, doesn't it? And the same kind of thing with those that are being treated for blood cholesterol. If we look at something like C-reactive protein, CRP, you might know this is a chemical in the blood that gives a good indication of the amount of inflammation in the body. And again, we see this difference that the vegans, and to some extent the lactose, seem to be advantaged compared to the non-vegetarians. A measure of risk of diabetes is the amount of insulin in the blood if you're fasting. And again, the vegetarians as a group do differently and better than the non-vegetarians. So it appears that some of the things that we like to think about with respect to heart disease would be advantaged by being a vegetarian. So what about being an average Adventist? not looking at the different kinds of Adventists and your risk of heart attack as compared to an average non-Adventist. And we've studied this as well. We made a comparison between a study of non-Adventists in California, and this is our Adventist Health Study 1, which was in California, and Adventists in California. We gave a risk score of 1 to the non-Adventists at different ages here, younger and older. And you can see that here's the experience of the non-Adventists at the different ages. By comparison, many fewer heart attacks at these different ages in the Adventist men and women. And this, interestingly, is particularly true in the younger and the middle age, a less pronounced difference as one got older. So what about eating and heart attack risk among Adventists? So now we're comparing actual heart attack experience, as in the last slide, but now different kinds of Adventists. Can we say, okay, the Adventists are doing better? How about within the group, can we get a clue as to what it is that's helping these Adventists do better? And just comparing in a simple way, vegetarians and non-vegetarians, what we're seeing here, that for both sexes and for men, and a little less so for women, that the vegetarian Adventists in yellow are doing better than the non-vegetarian Adventists in orange. And remember that in our Adventist group, the non-vegetarians are themselves a fairly healthy group by most standards. So this is a tough comparison. And yet we see, even in comparison to this relatively healthy group, our vegetarians are doing better. Here's a look at some particular dietary items that people eat. And this is the protein in the diet that comes from meat, and looking at the effect on heart attack and dying from heart attack at different ages according to whether you ate very little or zero meat protein as compared to eating a lot of meat protein. And you can see the risk of heart attack is going up almost exponentially here. A little less so in the middle-aged people, and not much at all in these that are getting older and the very elderly. So this is interesting. And by the way, you might say, well, why concentrate on protein? I thought it was fat. Well, it is saturated fat in some of these meats, but interestingly, it looks like the protein, even if we adjust for the effects of the dietary fats itself, carries some signal for risk. And this seems to be particularly pronounced for heart attack, not, I might say, for cancer, as we'll see, and life expectancy, but for heart attack, particularly pronounced in younger and middle-aged persons. Looking at another source of protein in the diet, nuts. And you can see comparing those who have very few nuts in their diet as compared to those that eat them 4 to 5 times a week, we see exactly the converse trend, that those who are eating more nuts have a substantial reduction in risk. But again, it's in the younger and middle-aged and less pronounced as you get older. So it looks like for cardiovascular disease and heart disease, what you do and how you eat seems to be particularly influential in eliminating or reducing premature deaths in young and middle-aged people. So now let's turn our attention to cancer. What is the risk of an average Adventist with respect to cancers compared to an average non-Adventist? Not looking at diets within the Adventists, just all Adventists. And this is looking at the cancers. So for all cancers, we gave, and this is data from the US Census population that have been published elsewhere. We collaborated with them. This is the experience of the non-Adventist US Census group, or virtually all non-Adventists. And here is the experience for different kinds of cancers here in the Adventists. And just putting all the Adventists together and all their cancers, you can see that there's a dramatic reduction of about 35%. If we look at just at our Black participants, very similar results. And cancers from different parts of the body, breast, prostate, colorectal, and so forth, all of these, or nearly all of them, hang to the left, which means lower values than the US population in general. This is adjusting for age and a number of other factors, including adjusting for smoking history, by the way. So this is not due to smoking, it's due to other factors in the Adventist group. Very interesting information. I'd like to now look at some of the particular cancers, common cancers, and individual foods. In other words, can we drill a little deeper and find out what it may be that is giving the Adventists this advantage? We are finding here, just briefly, that red meats seem to increase the risk of bowel cancer, and dairy decreases the risk. It may be the calcium content, we'll see, but dairy is related to decreased risk of bowel cancer. But dairy appears to, in our data, increase the risk of breast cancer and probably increases the risk of prostate cancer. Let me show you the evidence just quickly. This is now focusing on processed red meat, preliminary information from our study, and looking at more and more processed red meat and what does that do to risk of bowel cancer and processed red meats. And 50 grams a day is about one sausage a day. We had very few Adventists who were doing that, but we did have some. And we found that overall their risk of bowel cancer was more than 50% increased. That's even more than other studies have found, and that might be due to the very low risk of bowel cancer that we tend to have in our low-risk Adventists who don't eat meat. Now, bowel cancer, calcium intake, and dairy intake. First of all, calcium intake. Comparing Adventists who have relatively little calcium in their diet compared to those who have more calcium in their diet than most. And we find that those who have more calcium in their diet appear to have about a 50% reduction in risk of bowel cancer as compared to those who have little calcium in their diet or less calcium. And so we wondered, well, is it the calcium or is it the dairy? And without going to a lot of detail, we also compared then the bowel cancer experience of those who consumed no dairy milk and those who consumed about 2 glasses a day, quite a lot. And again, found a reduction in risk in those who had more dairy of about 1/3, and this was unlikely to be a chance observation. But we did things and made adjustments that it made it very likely that it was actually the calcium content of the dairy that was protective. So you may be able to get protection by getting calcium in other ways if you prefer to avoid dairy. Now looking at dairy milk intake and breast cancer risk. And let's just focus on this rather complicated slide on the solid black line here. And you'll notice that the risk of breast cancer goes up and up as the more and more dairy milk in this case. And notice that even by about 1 cup a day, we're looking at an increased risk apparently of about 50%. This is a somewhat controversial finding, but in our data, it appears to be quite strong. And we have the unusual ability to look at the influence of relatively small amounts of dairy intake because we have so many people that are down there, which is not true in many other studies. Notice that the adverse signal for dairy here seemed to come from dairy milk rather than cheese and yogurt. A similar look at prostate cancer risk and dairy intake. A little bit different shape to this graph because the scale here is structured differently. But in fact, the story is very similar to what we were finding with breast cancer, because we find that with only 1 cup of whole milk a day, this blue arrow, the risk is already apparently more than 50% higher as compared to those who consume no dairy. This is the risk of prostate cancer, a very common cancer in men, of course. And we're not the only study that's found something like this, but these are perhaps some of the strongest results that have looked at this question. So different diets and a risk of these bowel, breast, and prostate common cancers. Let's think about it a little bit more. So if we now look at the dietary patterns in relation to risk of these cancers, it turns out that all of the vegetarian groups did better than the non-vegetarian Adventists for bowel cancer. And this was probably the absence of red meat, which we discovered was a risk factor. And that's true in all the vegetarians, isn't it? But interestingly, the vegans didn't do quite as well for bowel cancer as the lacto-ovos and pescos, possibly due to their lower consumption of calcium and absence of dairy. For breast cancer, it was a very different story. We found there that the lacto-ovos, the pescos, and the non-vegetarians all had about the same risk of breast cancer, but the vegans look very different, about 30% lower, 25% lower. For prostate cancer, the same story. The lactose and pescos and non-vegetarians, all about the same risk, but the vegans look very different, about 35% lower. So that was probably due to the absence of the dairy in the vegans, which we've just seen was a risk factor apparently for breast and prostate cancers. So this is a story that all makes some kind of sense. When we look at the individual foods, when we look at the dietary groups, we get similar kinds of pictures. Well, now, what about being an average Adventist and life expectancy or risk of dying from any cause? Again, not here looking at the different kinds of Adventists, but an average Adventist compared to an average non-Adventist. Do we live longer, for instance? Well, the answer is yes, we do. And you've probably heard this story because it got a great deal of attention in the news. And interestingly, even nearly 20 years after we first reported it, it's still gaining traction out there. So we found here, and this was a study in California, actually, in our older AHS study, AHS1, that the men were living, the Adventist men, about 7 years longer than their non-Adventist neighbors. This is adjusting for age and a number of other factors. The women were living about 4.5 years longer than their non-Adventist neighbors. And if we looked at the vegetarian Adventists, the women were living about 9 years longer. The Adventists and the men, the men were about 9 years longer and the woman about 6 years longer. Put it in a slightly different way, the percent of, this case, men surviving to at least 85 years of age, that was true in about 20% of the general population, but double that in our Adventist men, about 40%, and in the vegetarians, nearly half. In the women, about 40% of the general population was surviving to 85, but nearly 55% of the Adventist women, and amongst the vegetarians, about 60%. So we're doing something right when it comes to living longer, which most people like to think that they'll have a good long life, providing the quality of life is good. And we'll come to that in just a moment. But focusing now on mortality, this time in our new study, Adventist Health Study 2, or our most recent study, and back to that comparison of the US census population and risk of dying from any cause as the general population compared to the Adventist risk of dying, adjusting for age and adjusting for smoking here and other education and other factors. And we find that there's, again, about a 35% reduction in risk in the blacks, even a little bit more so. And if you were dying of cancer, your reduction was a little bit less, but still very significant. And as compared to dying of other causes, where we had about an almost 40% reduction in risk. So impressive data. So what about now looking at the eating habits, in other words, different kinds of Adventists and risk of dying within the Adventist group? Are there differences? And again, making this very tough comparison between these non-vegetarian Adventists who are pretty healthy anyhow as compared to the general population, as we've just seen. When we look at the average Adventist, they're doing better. It's not just the vegetarians. But even compared to this rather healthy group, our vegetarian Adventists are doing better, particularly in men, a little less convincingly in women. We maybe need more numbers there. I want to look now at diet in a slightly different fashion. We've been looking at the kinds of foods that we're eating, but now I want to look at that in a different way. Foods can be prepared in different ways. We're here interested in deciding, are there different kinds of vegetarian diets, some of which even different kinds of, say, lacto-vegetarian diets, even different kinds of vegans that depend on the level of processing of the foods that people choose to eat. And you can see we've defined here, to just give you some idea, for fruits, these are what we might call highly processed kinds of fruit consumption as compared to these highly processed kind of vegetables, grain foods, some processed, highly processed meat analogs. All of them are at least moderately processed. And we did this for about 40 different dietary articles, and I don't have time to show you all that, but you get the idea of how we were able to categorize diets as to the amount of highly processed food that people were consuming. And again, just to keep things simple, let's focus here on the bars of ringed in yellow. This is a comparison of all Adventists now, comparing people who prefer highly processed or a lot of highly processed foods to the risk, which is this interrupted line of people who have very few processed foods. And you can see there's about a 24% increase in risk of Adventists overall if they prefer highly processed foods as compared to those who have little of those. Now, we look at the vegetarians only. And again, we find a very similar thing, about a 27% increase. So it appears that being a vegetarian is not the whole story by any means, and that a lot of the signal, the advantage of being a vegetarian is possibly due to the fact that vegetarian foods tend to be a little less highly processed. But we're finding here that even within the vegetarian group, there's a big difference according to the foods that you choose to eat in terms of their processing. And the same kind of thing was true if we focused only on the non-vegetarians, again, about a 20% increase in risk. And these are significant, they're unlikely to be chance findings. I'll pass this slide. Now, I did want to just, coming towards the end here, being an average Adventist and feeling good. Can we expect to feel good and as compared to an average non-Adventist? And so here we're talking about the quality of life, physical and mental. In fact, I'm only going to talk to you about mental quality of life, but you'll have to trust me that I could have shown you some slides that looked at physical quality of life that look almost the same. So here's what we're finding. Looking at women now, the black line here is the United States norms at different ages. And this here is a score of quality, mental quality of life as people get older. And you can see that there's a slight tendency for this to improve as people get older, but then at the very old age to drop back. Well, how do the Adventists compare? And here is what we see. This is for black and white Adventists, and you can see at all ages, virtually all ages, the Adventists are doing better in their mental quality of life. This is for women, remember. For men, let's have a look at the same thing. The US norms and the Adventist men are always apparently doing better. So not only do we live longer, we live better. And I think that's really important to realize. A little bit about religion. We're all religious people. And I want to talk to you a little bit about findings, and this is just scratching the surface of the kind of things that some of my colleagues, social epidemiologists, have been looking at and writing about. Religious coping, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Let's see if that relates to depressive feelings. And you can see here, this is a scale of this religious coping from less of it to more of it, and feelings of depression, depressive feelings. What are we finding? We find that looking at all the Adventists together, that those who have a better score on this religious coping are having fewer depressive feelings. And if you've recently divorced, this is even a more dramatic relationship. So what do we mean by this religious coping? It's dealing with major problems in your life by working together with God as a partner, looking to God for strength and support and guidance, confessing my sins, asking God's forgiveness. Well, I had a little difficulty at times remembering what this meant, and suddenly it occurred to me there was a simple way. What about this? What a friend we have in Jesus, all our sins and griefs to bear, or Under his wings I'm safely abiding, or there is a place of quiet rest near to the heart of God, and so on. So many of these great old hymns that maybe did more for us than just sound great when played on a grand pipe organ. So now I'm going to summarize, and I've said a lot of things, but if you can remember this, a foundation, I think, is the idea of preferring or trending towards plant-based diets as you're able. And we particularly talked about a variety of foods. Nuts appeared to decrease risk. Dairy milk was perhaps helpful for bowel cancer, although it may have been mainly the calcium content, but for breast and prostate cancers, not at all, maybe increased risk. And red meats particularly seem to be hazardous for a number of different causes, some cancers, cardiovascular disease, etc. So prefer a plant-based diet, and also avoid many highly processed foods, whether or not you're a vegetarian. And so I think these two things can form a easy to remember foundation. Digging a little deeper, we found that Adventists had better heart health. They had less cancers in many cases. They had less diabetes. They had greater longevity. They had less overweight, particularly if they were vegetarian. Remember to, if possible, eat most of your calories before the evening. What about a comparison of vegans and other vegetarians? Well, the vegans were doing well in some areas, but overall, actually, the longevity was about the same for all vegetarians, and all of them were doing better than the non-vegetarian Adventists. Remember, if you're a vegan, you must supplement with vitamin B12. And actually, it's a good idea also for older lacto-ovo vegetarians to do the same, as the vitamin B12 is less well absorbed as we get older. And finally, mental health, religious coping, feelings of depression, and what a friend we have in Jesus. So, in summary, again, as Adventists, we have a great story to tell about healthy living. Good diet is only part of the equation. It's what I've focused on. It's an important part. So finally, let me wish you the rich blessings of God as you pursue tasty, healthy eating, because it's surely one way to honor our Creator. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gary Fraser. What a joy it is to have you with us. And I don't know that our Zoom viewers know, but it's 3 o'clock in the morning in New Zealand.
That's right. Not my very best time for intelligent discussion, but let's see how it goes.
Well, Gary, I don't want to embarrass you, but I've known you for many years now, and I've never heard you give anything but intelligent discussion. So thank you so much for a really wonderful presentation. And, you know, you have touched on so many important points. For those of our viewers who don't know you, Dr. Gary Fraser is a professor at Loma Linda University. He's also been the principal investigator of the Adventist Health Study too. And of previous health studies, he's done a tremendous work and reanalysis, written a great book on diet, life expectancy, and chronic disease. And he and I have a very significant theme in common. He is a cardiologist. He's a clever cardiologist, though, because he's also an epidemiologist. So he understands all the figures and the facts related to how this health message has made such a difference. Gary, thank you for sharing your expertise. It's been amazing to have that bird's eye view of Adventist health and the blessing we have in this message. Do you feel more encouraged as you have studied this more and more?
Yes, I do. I mean, I grew up Adventist. I was lucky in that respect, which, of course, provided the interest to study this in a scientific way. And as we've done more and more, the value to what we've been brought up with, to understand and to practice, continues to become clearer and clearer.
There's a question which you can kick off with: is there any vegan source of B12, vitamin B12? Can we get it from any source that's plant-based?
Not that I'm aware of. For a time, there was a thought that bacteria in our mouth and our gut naturally may provide vitamin B12, but I think the evidence is that that is not really sufficient. The answer is that I'm not aware of any such source.
Now, I'm glad you mentioned that little piece of research about the source in the mouth not being sufficient, and because there are people who rely on that. And what we encourage from health ministries: use dairy if you use it as a condiment where it's not available. We're a world church, and in many parts, people don't have B12 supplementation. And so we suggest the use of dairy as a condiment, in other words, very small amounts. And then, as those of us who are vegetarian, and particularly those who are total vegetarian, to supplement B12, and particularly in the over-lactose as well, as we get older, because B12 absorption is less as we grow older. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's just so important. Interestingly, in the United States, Adventists, we've studied this, and by and large, our vegans there are doing the right thing. But as you point out, in different parts of the world, the challenge is greater, I think.
And you see, the challenge, I think, is complicated when there are so many fortified foods with B12 in, for example, the United States, maybe in Australia, New Zealand. But I know, having worked in many parts of our world field where we go and actually look at the foodstuffs, not every place has got fortification, be it in the soy milk or whatever it may be. So to be conscious of that, really appreciate that. Someone has asked the question of what you think about intermittent fasting. Is it sustainable? They were talking about the abstaining from food from sunset to sunrise 5 days a week, and a biblical fast 2 days a week. Now, and that means abstaining from food and drink on those 2 days, or from food at least. What do you think of that sort of approach, and not as opposed to, but along with the excellent advice you've given us today?
Yeah. Well, there is evidence that just thinking about body weight, that intermittent fasting does seem to be effective. What we lack, I think, is much evidence as to what that does to one's health over decades of experience of that sort. And personally, I think it's easier to think about something that you can do consistently from day to day by having, one, a good diet, and it appears that to prefer a plant-based diet is associated with less problems with overweight, and also to be sure that you don't have your big meal of the day in the evening and later in the evening. It's something that you can do consistently. But I personally wouldn't particularly criticize anyone who decided that the intermittent fasting was something they could explore, but we just simply don't know what the impact that might have on heart disease or cancer or some of these other things over decades of experience.
Thank you. Now, somebody's asking, and a very important and very good question: what is vitamin B12?
Yes. Well, vitamin B12 is actually a very complex chemical, such that our bodies do not manufacture it. It's gotten from other sources, and typically animal sources, actually. And that's part of the problem, that there is a very complex system whereby our bodies absorb it that requires something called intrinsic factor in the stomach. And unfortunately, as we get older, it appears that works less well, as you've mentioned. But it's a very important chemical for the multiplication of cells, particularly for the continued health of our nervous system. Particularly severe kind of anemia, pernicious anemia can develop if you're not getting enough of it as you get older. So it's not something that's to be trifled with, the absence of B12. Mm.
And in that context, there's a question: if the Lord made us to be total vegetarian or plant-based, as it were, looking at the Eden diet instructions, why would we need supplements? And my thought goes immediately to the fact that once we were banned from the Garden of Eden, we don't know what physiologic changes may have taken place. And apart from that, God himself, after the flood, then allowed a different form of diet to be included. So I think that we need to carefully weigh the argument of the origin in Eden to where we are in our fallen state with 6,000 plus years of sin behind us. And I think that gives me peace as to understanding that the rationale or the reason for vitamin B12 supplementation is reasonable. Do you agree with that?
Well, that's excuse me, an interesting way of looking at it, Peter. And yeah, that gives me some peace and a good rationale for. But fortunately, as you've pointed out, if you don't insist on being totally vegan, a little bit of dairy, perhaps even a little fish, is, I think, consistent with a good dietary practice as well. Although with the dairy, we are finding, at least for prostate cancer and possibly breast cancer, somewhat of an adverse signal. So I would say that if you have, for instance, a bad family history for either prostate or breast cancer, be a little cautious there. Mm.
Thank you, Gary. I would point out to our viewers that on healthministries.com, we have fact sheets related to vitamin B12, also to the application of a vegetarian diet. Feel free to go to that, look for the resources, and you'll find these available to you. And Dr. Fraser and many that he's trained have had a role in putting those together. A question is raised, how many micrograms of B12 is needed a day? And I hesitate to answer that question, but maybe you know.
Well, I'm not really a nutritionist. I'm a nutritional epidemiologist, which is a little bit different. But my understanding is that you actually only need about 1 microgram a day, which is a tiny, tiny dose. But that needs to be absorbed into your body or injected into your body. Now, what I do, being an older guy and largely vegetarian, I take every second day a pill that's got about 1 milligram. And it turns out that even that's a very tiny amount, actually. But if you swallow it, it's about 1,000 times of what you really need a day. Even if your intrinsic factor is not doing too well, you will get enough of it through. So that's a simple way to overcome the problem if you have that ability to get some of these pills that contain small amounts, but still hugely more than what you actually need physiologically.
Thank you very much for sharing that. And I think that your brief explanation, and we have such a press on time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The reason why it's often important to take a little more B12 in the supplement form is to make sure that it's absorbed. And the best form when it's by mouth is one that dissolves in the mouth, because the process of absorption triggers and starts right up in the mouth, with saliva combining into the stomach and then through the intrinsic factors. So it's important to make sure that we do that. Also, if you visit our Health Ministries booth, you will find these resources available to you, and we are we're delighted, and we're delightful at times to invite you to meet with us. Is the health study 2 over, Dr. Fraser?
Yes, largely over from the participant point of view. It's generated, of course, a huge amount of data, and we are going to be continuing to explore many, many questions and to publish and to let you know the answers that we get. We do have ideas about a subsequent health study to continue on, but that's still in a formative stage. But it's very possible that we'll be inviting particularly AHS2 participants, but possibly others as well, to come and to continue to participate, because, truthfully, we're so thankful for the participants throughout the United States and Canada, about nearly 100,000 Adventists. Without you, of course, we couldn't have done anything. And it took significant effort, and thank you very much.
Yeah, everyone has been so crucial in doing that. And there are a lot of questions coming in on the vitamin B12, and I think this is important. The one question is a multivitamin enough? I don't think we can answer that question, because the content of B complex tablets vary around the world and the regions. So you're going to have to read the labels on the bottles of any vitamin you may think you need to take. And if any doubt, ask your physician. I think this is very important, that we do not give direct medical counsel, because we would love to, but we really don't know each of you well enough to be able to do that. So we would, urge that you make sure that you look at the labels as we should with all the foods we consume. We should be label readers and avoid the salt and and I appreciate so much when you talked again about the over-processed. Stick with the non-refined foods. So those are key and crucial. And somebody asked the question, Gary, why do we need vitamin B12? And there's so much about the nerve tissue and blood. Share with us. Why is it so essential?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned before, what we know very clearly, medically have known for decades, what happens if we don't get enough of it. And it's, as I said, it's not a trivial problem. Severe anemia, problems with your balance, some of the nerve fibers in the spinal column tend to degenerate, so that your gait, your ability to walk properly, there's evidence that your cognitive abilities, your ability to think properly are affected. So, like I said, this is not a trivial matter. And, there was a study done of actually Adventist pastors in Australia 2 or 3 decades ago. My cousin actually did this, and found that even though most of those pastors were lacto-ovo-vegetarians, not strict vegetarians, many of them had very borderline levels in their blood of vitamin B12. So again, this is something that we do need to focus on and think about.
Thank you, Gary. Just to repeat for everybody, where you can find the resource on vitamin B12 is on Health Ministries, all one word, .com. There are other questions which have come in, which are very interesting. And one is the global reach of our church. Has there been any plan to study other populations outside of North America? And I'm delighted that my good friend, Dr. Ganu from Adventist University of Africa, is on this meeting. And thank you, Dr. Fraser, for also being an advisor to that group, because he has led a team to look at Adventist health among our believers in Africa. So that data is coming together, and it's going to be exciting to see that. And one of the very important things is that the health message and what you've been sharing with us is applicable and replicatable. So it doesn't only occur in North America, but we see advantages elsewhere. Do you want to comment on that, Gary?
Yes, well, I mean, there's been data on Adventists that have come from several countries in Europe, Denmark, Norway, Netherlands, a little bit from Japan a number of years ago. Some good work is being done in Brazil, out of Sao Paulo, and you mentioned in Africa and Nigeria. So we're not alone, but these studies tend to be quite expensive, quite difficult to undertake. We believe but it's so good to get the real evidence that people are people are people. And the genetic differences between groups of people that we think of as being rather different are actually very small. And by and large, to the extent that we've been able to study it, different racial groups tend to have the similar responsiveness to lifestyle and how it affects their risk of disease. For instance, we've looked very carefully, and I think I mentioned that about 26,000 of our participants in Adventist Health Study 2 are African American. And yet we're finding, by and large, the same things seem to be protective or hazardous in that group, which is genetically very similar, in fact, to Europeans. There's not a lot of differences between the racial groups and our metabolic processes and our genes, actually.
Thank you, Gary. You've given us a tremendous amount of good information. Just to repeat, because the questions are coming up, healthministries.com/GCNC will take you quickly to the fact sheets. And also, if you go to the Health Ministries booth and look under that and resources, you'll find much of what we're talking about today. Again, I see questions still coming through. Why is it does a substance such as spirulina have B12 in it? Gary, are you aware of that?
Look, I'm sorry, Peter, I'm not. I would hesitate to answer that. I'm just not sufficiently familiar.
Okay. No, and I think that we need to be careful. Sometimes there are claims, and I think that one of the things we need to remember is that the main source of vitamin B12 is generally an animal source. And therefore, and I don't think that we should push back. There's an excellent story in the life of Ellen White where a Dr. Kress of the time, went on to a total vegetarian diet. And of course, then they didn't know what vitamin B12 was. And he was on his deathbed, and she actually wrote to him because she was impressed to say, you must take a glass of grape juice every day with an egg whipped up in it. And they were ready to bury him almost, and he got better and did many years of further service in mission work. So we need to be practically balanced in our approaches. And, there are questions coming in. Is a little bit of yogurt okay for a vegan to take, and the curds? Is that enough vitamin B12? I think that the real answer to that question, Gary, and we're going to have to close on this one, is that you need to check with your physician, because there are very definite, not only clinical signs, but importantly, blood test signs, which will tell you if you are vitamin deficient, vitamin B12 deficient especially.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I very much understand that we shouldn't be giving individual advice in a format like this, but there are broad trends that we can study. And when you study 100,000 people, we're not talking about the individual level, but we are saying that overall, this is a good way to live your life, it appears. And we are fortunately finding, I think, some very interesting signals, things that many of us can do that apparently, on average at least, will make a big difference.
Gary, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who's attended. And again, my gratitude to you for being up this late or this early. And each one of us is deeply grateful, and we are inspired by the work that you have done and continue to do. God bless and keep you all, and stay healthy. And we look forward to meeting in the kingdom where parting will be no more. God bless. Godspeed. Thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Rest well.
Bye-bye.
You deserve it.
All right. Okay.